On a quiet evening, Mason Sanders sat in his fire station office, wrapping up paperwork from a long shift. A seasoned firefighter and first responder, he was known for his steadfast, no-nonsense demeanor. Mason had spent years serving his community, always moving from one emergency to the next with unwavering focus. Yet, as he settled back into his chair, he couldn't help but feel the familiar pang of loneliness, a feeling he'd been accustomed to in his empty apartment, where no family or warm lights awaited him after his shifts. That night, as he drove back through the suburbs under the streetlights, he slowed down upon reaching a local playground. The swings swayed gently in the breeze, and everything seemed peaceful. But as he scanned the playground, Mason's eyes locked onto a small figure curled up on a park bench. He narrowed his gaze, squinting to see more clearly, and realized it was a young girl, fast asleep, with only a thin sweater covering her in the cold. Mason parked his truck, stepping out slowly. His boots crunched against the gravel as he approached, cautious not to startle her. As he got closer, he could see her small frame shivering, her dark curls covering her face, and he felt a pang in his heart. For a moment, he hesitated, unsure of what he should do. In all his years on duty, he had never come across a child sleeping alone in a public park at night. "Hey there, sweetheart," he spoke softly, gently touching her shoulder. The girl stirred, her eyes fluttering open with a frightened look as she saw the tall, uniformed man looming over her. "It's okay," Mason said, trying to sound as gentle as possible. "I'm Mason, a firefighter. You're safe. What's your name?" She looked at him, hesitant and wary, but eventually whispered, "Lisa." "Lisa, it's getting late and very cold out here. Why are you sleeping on this bench?" he asked, keeping his voice soft and warm. Lisa hesitated, glancing down at her hands. I'm waiting for my mom," she said, her voice barely audible. "She went to find work and she said she'd come back." Mason's heart sank. He knelt down beside her, trying to meet her at eye level, and noticed a glimmer of tears in her eyes. He could see the vulnerability in her, a child trying to be brave but carrying a burden too heavy for someone her age. "How long have you been waiting here, Lisa?" he asked gently. She looked away, her lip trembling. 5 days, she whispered, almost as if she was ashamed to admit it. Mason felt a wave of sorrow wash over him. He couldn't imagine the fear and loneliness she must have felt, waiting in the cold with no one around. He cleared his throat, trying to keep his voice steady. "Lisa, it's not safe for you to be here by yourself. Let's find you somewhere warm tonight, okay?" Lisa looked back at the bench, uncertainty flickering in her eyes. "But my mom said to wait here. What if she comes back and I'm gone?" Mason felt his heart tighten. He didn't want to break the delicate trust she had in her mother, but he also knew that leaving her alone was not an option. "How about this?" he suggested. "You come with me tonight. We'll find somewhere safe, and I'll help you look for your mom. I promise I won't stop until we do." After a moment of hesitation, Lisa finally nodded, clutching her small backpack as if it were her lifeline. Mason guided her to his truck, helping her settle in the front seat. She looked so small and fragile, sitting beside him in the dim light. As they drove back to the fire station, Mason glanced at her from time to time, noticing the way she stared out the window, lost in her thoughts. He wanted to reassure her, to tell her that everything would be okay, but he also knew that words alone wouldn't erase the loneliness and fear she had felt. Once back at the station, Mason led Lisa to a small break room where he grabbed a blanket and wrapped it around her shoulders. He rummaged through the supplies, finally offering her a warm cup of hot chocolate. Lisa accepted it with trembling hands, her small face lighting up as she sipped the warmth. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice soft but genuine. Mason sat down beside her, feeling an unfamiliar tug at his heart, a protective instinct he hadn't felt in a long time. He watched as Lisa slowly relaxed, her eyes drooping as the warmth took effect. "Lisa," he began, his voice gentle, "I'm going to make some calls, okay? We'll figure this out together." She nodded, settling into the chair as if it were the most comfortable place she had been in days. Mason stepped outside, pulling out his phone. His mind raced with thoughts of how he would approach this, how he could find her mother and ensure that Lisa had a safe place to stay. He dialed social services, hoping for some guidance. As he waited on hold, he glanced back through the small window at Lisa, who had wrapped herself tightly in the blanket, her eyes closed as she drifted off to sleep. In that moment, Mason made a decision. He wasn't going to hand this off to someone else. He would see this through himself. Returning to the room, he knelt beside Lisa, who was already half asleep. "I've arranged for somewhere safe for you to stay tonight," he whispered, "but I want you to know something important, Lisa. I promise you, I'll do everything I can to find your mom." For the first time since they'd met, Lisa's face softened with a glimmer of hope. She looked up at him with tired, trusting eyes, and Mason felt a lump form in his throat. This small, vulnerable child had come to mean something to him in a way he hadn't anticipated. As Lisa's breathing slowed and she finally fell asleep, Mason sat beside her, feeling the weight of his promise settle within him. He knew that the journey ahead wouldn't be easy, that there would be countless hurdles and unknowns, but he also knew deep down that he wouldn't rest until he'd brought this little girl and her mother back together. The following morning, Mason awoke early, his mind already filled with thoughts of the young girl he'd found the night before. After settling Lisa in a secure place at the station, he had stayed close by, checking in on her periodically. Now, with dawn breaking through the station's windows, he made his way to the small break room where Lisa was still sleeping soundly, wrapped in the warm blanket he'd given her. He approached quietly, not wanting to startle her awake. As he looked at her peaceful face, he noticed the faint traces of tear streaks on her cheeks and the dark circles under her eyes. She looked vulnerable, but somehow strong, too, a child who had been through more than any young person should ever have to endure. After a few minutes, Lisa began to stir. She blinked up at Mason, momentarily disoriented before recognition dawned in her eyes. She sat up, rubbing her eyes with small fists. "Good morning, Lisa." Mason greeted her with a gentle smile. "Did you sleep okay?" Lisa nodded slowly, then looked down, as if uncertain of what to say. The silence was thick with unspoken questions, and Mason decided it was time to ease her mind a bit. "Are you hungry?" he asked. "I thought we could grab some breakfast. There's a great little diner just down the road. They make the best pancakes in town." Lisa's face softened slightly, and she nodded, a hint of excitement flickering in her eyes. After making sure she was comfortable, Mason led Lisa out to his truck. They drove in companionable silence, the early morning sun casting a warm glow over the town. It felt like a new beginning, somehow, like a chance to set things right for this little girl. At the diner, Mason ordered a stack of pancakes, eggs, and bacon for them to share. As they waited for their food, he noticed Lisa looking around with a curious yet cautious expression, as if she wasn't quite sure if she belonged there. "Lisa," Mason began, leaning forward to meet her gaze, "you don't have to worry about anything right now. You're safe, and we're going to figure things out together. I'll do everything I can to help you find your mom." Lisa looked at him with wide, searching eyes. Do you really think you can find her?" she asked softly, a thread of hope woven into her words. Mason nodded. "I promise, Lisa. I've been doing this job a long time, and I don't give up easily. We'll find your mom." Their food arrived, and they ate in comfortable silence, with Lisa occasionally glancing up at Mason, as if trying to gauge if he truly meant what he said. Mason watched as she carefully cut her pancakes, savoring each bite. He could tell she hadn't had a decent meal in days. Once they'd finished eating, Mason took her back to the station, where he set her up with some paper and colored pencils, giving her something to do while he made a few more calls. He reached out to local shelters, hospitals, and nearby police stations, hoping for any information about a woman matching Lisa's description of her mother. Every call he made, however, seemed to lead to another dead end, leaving him frustrated yet more determined. Later, as Mason returned to check on Lisa, he found her sitting cross-legged on the floor, drawing intently. She looked up as he entered, her face lighting up with a shy smile. She held up her drawing, a colorful picture of a playground with swings and slides, and a little girl sitting on a bench with a stuffed animal. It's the park where I was waiting for my mom," she explained, her voice barely above a whisper. Mason knelt beside her, studying the picture. "It's beautiful, Lisa," he said warmly. "Do you go to that park often?" Lisa nodded. "Yes, it was our favorite place. Mom said it was safe, and that if I ever got scared, I could go there and wait for her. Her voice grew quieter, and she looked down, clutching her drawing. She promised she'd come back. Mason felt a lump form in his throat. He wanted to reassure her, to promise her that her mother would return, but he also knew that he couldn't make promises he wasn't sure he could keep. Instead, he reached out, gently patting her shoulder. "I know it's hard to wait," he said softly, "but I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere. We'll keep looking together, okay?" Lisa looked up at him, her eyes bright with a mix of sadness and hope. "Thank you, Mason," she whispered. Over the next few days, Mason continued his search, but every lead seemed to come up empty. Each night, he would stop by the station to check on Lisa, bringing her small treats and little activities to keep her occupied. He began to notice how her eyes would light up whenever he arrived, and how she would share small details about her life with him. Her favorite colors, her love for animals, and memories of her mother. One evening, as they sat together in the station's lounge, Lisa turned to him, her expression hesitant but hopeful. "Mason," she began, her voice trembling slightly, Can you tell me a story?" Mason was taken aback, but he quickly nodded, smiling gently. "Of course," he replied. "What kind of story would you like to hear?" Lisa thought for a moment, her face brightening. "A story about you. What did you do when you were little?" Mason chuckled softly. He hadn't thought about his childhood in years, but something about the way Lisa looked at him made him want to share a part of himself. He told her about growing up in a small town, about his dreams of becoming a firefighter, and how he used to play games with his friends in the woods behind his childhood home. As he spoke, Lisa listened intently, her eyes wide with fascination. For the first time, Mason felt himself lowering the walls he had built around his heart, letting her in. He realized that in helping her, he was also finding parts of himself he had lost along the way. That night, as Lisa settled down to sleep, she looked up at Mason with a shy smile. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "for everything." Mason felt a warmth spread through his chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. He gently tucked the blanket around her, watching as she drifted off to sleep. In that moment, he made a silent promise to himself, to protect this little girl, to keep her safe, and to do everything in his power to find her mother. As he left the room, Mason felt a newfound sense of purpose, a feeling that, perhaps, he was exactly where he needed to be. And as he walked down the quiet hallways of the station, he realized that Lisa had given him something he hadn't even known he was missing, a reason to believe in hope again. As the days turned into a week, Mason grew more determined to find answers about Lisa's mother. Every morning, he drove Lisa to school and picked her up afterward, ensuring she had a sense of routine and normalcy despite the challenges she faced. Lisa seemed to thrive under the structure, slowly growing more comfortable around him and even sharing small glimpses of her past with him. One afternoon, after picking her up from school, Mason stopped by the station with Lisa in tow. He had a few more phone calls to make, checking in with different shelters and community centers in neighboring towns, hoping for any lead. Lisa sat nearby, drawing quietly, but he could feel her eyes on him, watching as he made call after call, her expression a mix of hope and caution. After a series of dead-end calls, Mason hung up, sighing as he leaned back in his chair. Lisa looked up at him, her brow furrowing in concern. Is everything okay?" she asked softly. Mason forced a small smile, not wanting her to worry. "It's just taking a little longer than I'd hoped," he replied, "but we're not giving up. I'll keep looking until we find her." Lisa nodded, a small smile forming on her face. "I know you will. You always keep your promises," she said with quiet confidence. Touched by her faith in him, Mason reached over and gave her a reassuring pat on the shoulder. "That's right, Lisa. We're in this together." Later that evening, Mason took Lisa to a nearby park. He thought the fresh air might lift her spirits, and he could see her eyes light up as they arrived, her gaze scanning the playground with a mix of excitement and nostalgia. She ran over to the swings, and Mason watched her, smiling as she laughed, the worries of the past few days momentarily forgotten. "Push me?" she asked, looking over her shoulder with a shy grin. Mason chuckled and walked over, gently pushing her on the swing. Her laughter echoed through the park, and for a moment Mason felt a pang of protectiveness he hadn't anticipated. She was such a resilient little girl. Yet he knew that beneath her brave exterior lay a heart that yearned for her mother's return. As the sun began to set, they sat on a bench overlooking the park, watching the golden hues spread across the sky. Lisa grew quiet, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "Mason," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "do you think my mom misses me?" Mason felt a lump form in his throat. He wanted to reassure her, to tell her that her mother was searching for her just as they were searching for her mother. But he also knew that he couldn't make promises he couldn't keep. "Lisa," he said softly, choosing his words carefully, "I think your mom loves you very much, and I think she would want you to be safe and happy, no matter where she is." Lisa nodded, her eyes shining with unshed tears. I miss her so much," she admitted, her voice trembling. Mason gently wrapped an arm around her shoulders, offering her silent comfort. "I know, Lisa, I know. And I promise we'll keep looking. We'll find her." Over the next few days, Mason's search intensified. He called every shelter, hospital, and community organization within a 50-mile radius, leaving no stone unturned. His colleagues at the fire station began to notice the change in him, the way he had thrown himself into the search with a determination they hadn't seen before. One evening, as he was going through another stack of papers and making yet another round of calls, his coworker, Tom, stopped by his office, leaning against the doorframe with a curious look. "Mason, you've been at this all week. What's going on?" Tom asked, his tone laced with genuine concern. Mason looked up, pausing for a moment before speaking. "It's about the little girl, Lisa," he replied, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "She doesn't have anyone else, Tom. Her mother, she's out there somewhere, and I promised Lisa I'd find her." Tom nodded, his expression softening. "You've really taken her under your wing, haven't you?" Mason sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "I didn't plan on it, but I can't just let her go. She's been through so much already." Tom clapped a reassuring hand on Mason's shoulder. "If anyone can find her mom, it's you. And if you need any help, just let me know." Encouraged by his friend's support, Mason renewed his search with fresh determination. That night, after tucking Lisa into bed at the temporary shelter, he decided to visit the hospital where she had mentioned her mother had once gone to look for work. He figured it was a long shot, but he was willing to try anything. At the hospital, Mason spoke with the receptionist, describing the woman he was looking for. The receptionist frowned thoughtfully, then checked their records. "There was a woman who matched that description a few weeks ago," she said slowly. "She was in a minor accident but left before we could get her full information. I remember she mentioned she was trying to find work." Mason's heart skipped a beat. "Do you know where she went afterward?" The receptionist shook her head. "I'm sorry, sir," she didn't say. "But we did have a contact number on file, though it's been disconnected." Though it was another lead that didn't pan out, Mason felt a renewed sense of purpose. This small piece of information confirmed that Lisa's mother had been in the area recently, which meant they were on the right track. He returned to the station with a glimmer of hope, determined to share the news with Lisa the next day. He knew it wasn't much, but he hoped that even a small sign of progress would give her the encouragement she needed to keep going. The following morning, Mason picked Lisa up, and they went to the park once again before heading to school. As they sat on a bench, he shared the news with her, watching as her eyes lit up with hope. "So, she was really close by?" Lisa asked, her voice filled with excitement. "Yes," Mason replied, smiling. "It means we're getting closer. We just have to keep looking." Lisa nodded, a new determination evident in her expression. She looked up at him, her gaze steady and filled with gratitude. "Thank you, Mason," she whispered. "I don't know what I'd do without you." Mason felt a surge of emotion, realizing that he'd grown attached to this brave little girl in a way he hadn't anticipated. He wasn't just searching for her mother to fulfill a promise anymore. He was doing it because he genuinely cared about Lisa and wanted to see her safe and happy. As they walked back to the truck, he made a silent vow to himself. He would keep looking no matter how long it took, and he wouldn't rest until he had brought Lisa and her mother back together. The next week, as Mason continued his search, he was contacted by a social worker named Megan, who had heard about Lisa's situation through local networks. Megan worked closely with several community shelters and outreach programs in the city, and she wanted to help Mason track down any possible leads on Lisa's mother. They arranged to meet at the station that afternoon, and when Megan arrived, Mason introduced her to Lisa. Megan knelt down to Lisa's level, giving her a warm smile. "Hi, Lisa. I'm Megan. I'm here to help Mason find your mom," she said gently. Lisa looked at her cautiously, glancing back at Mason for reassurance. When he nodded encouragingly, she offered Megan a small, shy smile. "Thank you," she whispered. As Megan began discussing possible approaches and resources they could explore, Mason felt a renewed sense of hope. Megan had a lot of experience tracking down missing people, and her familiarity with local shelters and social services could help them open new doors in their search. Later that day, Mason and Megan drove to a nearby shelter, where Megan had recently been in contact with a woman who might fit Lisa's mother's description. It wasn't much of a lead, but Mason was hopeful that it might bring them one step closer to reuniting Lisa with her mother. When they arrived, Megan introduced Mason to the shelter's director, Mrs. Henderson, an older woman with a kind, no-nonsense demeanor. Mrs. Henderson invited them into her office, where she began pulling up records and reviewing files. "I remember a woman who came in about a month ago looking for temporary shelter," Mrs. Henderson said, flipping through her notes. "She didn't give us much information about herself, but she mentioned she had a young daughter. She stayed with us for just a night before moving on. I remember because she seemed very determined to find work quickly." Mason's heart quickened. "Do you remember where she was heading next?" Mrs. Henderson shook her head. "Unfortunately, no. She didn't have many belongings and seemed like she was in a hurry to leave. She did ask about job listings, particularly in housekeeping or diner work." Megan made a note of the information, while Mason felt both relief and frustration. They were getting closer, but the uncertainty still gnawed at him. Mrs. Henderson's account suggested that Lisa's mother had been in the area recently, which meant she was likely still somewhere nearby. As they prepared to leave, Mrs. Henderson offered Lisa a small stuffed bear from the shelter's donation bin. Lisa accepted it with a shy "thank you," clutching it tightly as they headed out. On the drive back, Megan shared a few new ideas with Mason. "I'll check with local job agencies and a few smaller diners in the area to see if anyone has hired someone matching her description," she said. "It might take some time, but if she's working somewhere under the table, someone might remember her." Mason nodded, feeling grateful for Megan's help. "Thank you for doing this, Megan. I was starting to feel like I was running out of leads." Megan smiled. "I know it can be frustrating, but sometimes these searches take time. The important thing is that you're here for Lisa, giving her hope and stability. That means a lot." When they arrived back at the station, Mason led Lisa to the small lounge where they'd spent so many evenings together. She looked up at him, her face a mix of curiosity and worry. Did they find my mom?" Mason knelt down beside her, resting a hand on her shoulder. "We're getting closer, Lisa. We know she was in town recently, and we're going to keep looking. Megan is working really hard to help us, too." Lisa nodded, hugging her new stuffed bear to her chest. "Thank you, Mason," she said softly. "I just want to see her again." Mason felt a surge of determination. He had promised her they would find her mother, and he wasn't going to let her down. Over the following days, Mason and Megan continued reaching out to more places, hoping for a breakthrough. Every time he came back with even a small piece of information, Lisa's eyes would light up, a flicker of hope sparking in her gaze. Mason knew that every step forward, no matter how small, meant the world to her. One evening, as Mason was finishing up at the station, he received a call from Megan. Her voice was filled with excitement. "Mason, I think we have something. I just spoke with a manager at a small diner across town, and he remembered a woman who matches the description of Lisa's mom. She worked there for a few days cleaning tables and washing dishes." Mason's heart leapt. "Did he say where she went?" Megan hesitated. "She left suddenly after just a few days, but he mentioned that she had been talking about finding a more permanent job in a neighboring town. It's not much, but it's the first real lead we've had." Mason thanked Megan and quickly made his way to Lisa's room. She was reading a book he'd picked up for her earlier in the week, her little bear resting beside her. When she saw Mason, she looked up expectantly, her eyes filled with hope. "Lisa," he began, trying to keep his voice steady, "Megan found out that your mom was working at a diner a little while ago. She left, but we're going to keep looking. It means we're getting closer." Lisa's face brightened, and she hugged her bear tightly. "So, She's really out there? Yes, Lisa, Mason replied, smiling. She's really out there, and we're not giving up. We're going to keep looking until we find her. Lisa leaned against him, a soft sigh escaping her. Thank you, Mason, for everything. As Mason sat there, he felt the weight of his promise more deeply than ever. He knew that each new lead brought them closer, but he also realized that his connection to Lisa had grown into something far beyond his duty. He had become her protector, her confidant, and her friend, and he would do whatever it took to bring her family back together. Over the next week, Mason and Megan continued chasing down leads about Lisa's mother. Every day after work, Mason would stop by the shelter to check on Lisa and give her updates, no matter how small. Each time he'd walk into her room, she would look up, eyes bright with hope, waiting to hear any news. One evening, Mason arrived with some exciting information. He had received a call from a local community center where a woman matching Lisa's mother's description had recently attended a job fair. The community center director, Miss Hall, remembered her distinctly because she had asked for recommendations on nearby shelters and low-cost housing. Although Miss Hall didn't know where she went afterward, she believed she was still looking for stable work. When Mason shared this news with Lisa, her face lit up, and she leaned forward eagerly. "Does that mean we're getting closer?" she asked, her voice filled with excitement. Mason smiled, nodding. "It does. We're piecing it together, bit by bit. Megan and I will keep following every lead we get." Lisa's eyes sparkled with gratitude. "Thank you, Mason. I know she's out there. I can feel it." Her optimism fueled Mason's determination even more. He spent hours every night sifting through information, calling places that might have had contact with Lisa's mother, and digging through records. His colleagues noticed the change in him, especially Tom, who often joined him on his nightly hunts for information, offering his support. One night, after an especially long day, Tom invited Mason to join him for coffee at a nearby diner. As they sat across from each other, Tom looked at Mason with a knowing smile. "You've really got a soft spot for that kid, don't you?" he said, his tone teasing yet affectionate. Mason chuckled, stirring his coffee thoughtfully. "Yeah, I guess I do. I didn't expect to feel this way, but Lisa, she's a special kid. She's been through so much, and she deserves a real chance at a happy life." Tom nodded, leaning back in his seat. "I get it. She's lucky to have you. Not many people would go to these lengths." Mason sighed, glancing out the window. "I keep thinking about what it would mean for her to finally be with her mom again. It's all she talks about." Tom placed a reassuring hand on Mason's shoulder. "You're doing everything you can, and from what I can see, you're already making a big difference in her life." Later that night, as Mason drove back to the shelter, he thought about Tom's words. The sense of responsibility he felt toward Lisa had grown into something deeper, a sense of purpose and connection that he hadn't felt in years. He realized that he was no longer searching for her mother just to fulfill a promise. He was doing it because he genuinely cared for Lisa and wanted to give her the stability and love she deserved. The following morning, Mason and Megan met up at the community center where Lisa's mother had last been seen. Miss Hall welcomed them and led them to her office, where she shared more details about the job fair and the different resources they had provided to attendees. She seemed very determined, Miss Hall recalled. "I remember her asking about several different jobs and how to sign up for the housing wait list. She was quiet but very polite, and you could tell she was motivated to make things work." Mason's heart ached as he listened. He could imagine Lisa's mother, worried, determined, and hopeful. She was clearly fighting for a better future for herself and her daughter. Miss Hall handed them a list of local employers who had attended the job fair, along with contact information for nearby shelters. "This might help," she said, smiling. "I really hope you find her. She seemed like she could use some support." Mason thanked Miss Hall and left with Megan, feeling both hopeful and anxious. Every lead they uncovered was a step closer, but he couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. Lisa was waiting, and each day without her mother was another day of uncertainty. As they drove back, Megan turned to him, her gaze sympathetic. "We're getting closer, Mason. Don't lose hope." Mason nodded, gripping the steering wheel tightly. "I just want her to have her mom back. She's such a strong kid, but I can see how much she's hurting." Back at the shelter that evening, Mason found Lisa sitting in her room, drawing quietly. When she saw him, she jumped up, a hopeful expression on her face. He smiled, kneeling down to her level. "We're getting closer, Lisa," he said, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We've found more places where your mom might have been, and Megan and I are following up on each one." Lisa's eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you, Mason. I know she's trying to come back. I just know it." Mason gave her a gentle squeeze on the shoulder. "We're not giving up, Lisa. We'll keep looking until we find her." As he left the shelter that night, Mason felt a renewed sense of purpose. He would keep searching, no matter how many phone calls, visits, or sleepless nights it took. He had made a promise to Lisa, and he would keep it, no matter what. The days rolled on, and Mason's routine had become a relentless cycle of phone calls, visits, and long discussions with Megan. Each lead they uncovered gave him renewed hope, but he was also aware of the strain this waiting game was putting on Lisa. She had grown quieter, retreating into herself more often, as if each unfruitful lead made her feel a little more lost. One late afternoon, Mason stopped by the shelter with a bag of Lisa's favorite snacks. A small gesture, but one he hoped would lift her spirits. He found her sitting by the window, clutching her new stuffed bear, and staring outside with a distant look. When she saw him, a small, shy smile appeared, but he could sense her sadness. "Hey, Lisa," he greeted her, holding up the bag. "Thought I'd bring you something to snack on. I figured we could have a little picnic right here." Her face lit up, and she nodded, following him to a cozy corner where they spread out the snacks. Mason sat with her as they nibbled on crackers and cheese, making small talk. He told her about the funny things he'd seen at work that day, and shared a story from his childhood, hoping to see her laugh. Eventually, he leaned in, his expression softening. "Lisa, I know this isn't easy. We're doing everything we can to find your mom, and I promise you, we're getting closer every day." Lisa looked down at her stuffed bear, running her fingers over its soft fur. I just wish she'd come find me, Mason. I miss her so much." Mason's heart ached at her words. He reached over, giving her a comforting squeeze on the shoulder. "She's out there, Lisa, and she's looking for you too. Megan and I are doing everything we can to make sure you two find each other again." She nodded quietly, a glimmer of hope returning to her eyes. They sat in silence for a moment, Lisa's small hand reaching out to rest on Mason's. He felt an overwhelming sense of responsibility, a determination to make good on his promise. That evening, Mason stayed at the station late, poring over files, hoping to find some overlooked detail, some hint that would lead them to Lisa's mother. His desk was littered with notes, addresses, and phone numbers. His phone buzzed, breaking his concentration. It was Megan. "Mason, I think we might have a breakthrough," she said, excitement evident in her voice. Mason sat up straighter. "Tell me." "I spoke with another shelter downtown," Megan began. "They recently housed a woman who fits Lisa's mother's description. She didn't stay long, but she mentioned trying to reach out to a family member in another city. The shelter director believes she might still be in the area, trying to arrange her next steps." Mason felt a surge of relief. This could be it. Do they know where she was heading next? "They don't know for sure," Megan admitted. "But they heard her talking about finding a stable job nearby. I think she's trying to get herself back on her feet before she finds Lisa." The weight of Megan's words sank in, filling Mason with a renewed sense of determination. "Thank you, Megan. I'll follow up with the shelter and see what I can find out." The next morning, Mason told Lisa about the new lead. Her eyes brightened, and she clutched his arm, her face a mixture of hope and uncertainty. "Do you really think she's close?" Mason nodded, smiling. "I do. I think she's trying to find a way to come back to you. She wants to make sure she can take care of you when she does." Lisa's smile returned, and she hugged him tightly, her small frame shaking with emotion. "Thank you, Mason. Thank you for helping me find her." For the first time, Mason felt that they were on the verge of a reunion, and as he watched Lisa's face light up, he knew that every moment, every sleepless night was worth it. The new lead stirred a sense of urgency in Mason. He spent the next 2 days reaching out to more shelters, community centers, and any place that might have had contact with Lisa's mother. Each phone call, each email brought them a step closer. One morning, Megan called Mason, her voice filled with anticipation. "Mason, you're not going to believe this. I got a call back from one of the downtown shelters. They confirmed that Lisa's mother, Caroline, was there a few days ago." Mason's heart pounded as he took in the news. "Did they say where she was going?" "They didn't get an address," Megan said, "but she mentioned something about looking for work at a local diner nearby. The shelter staff said she seemed hopeful about starting fresh. She really wanted to make things work." "That's perfect," Mason replied. "I'll start calling the diners in the area to see if any of them have seen her." The task was tedious, but Mason felt more determined than ever. Each call gave him hope, even as some diners came back with no information. Finally, he struck gold. A manager at a small diner on the outskirts of the city remembered a woman fitting Caroline's description. She had come in to ask about work, but hadn't been back since. However, the manager mentioned that she had left behind a small notebook by accident, a notebook that contained a few addresses and notes. "I'll come pick it up right away," Mason told the manager, heart racing. Later that afternoon, Mason held the notebook in his hands. It was well worn, with pages filled with Caroline's neat handwriting. Some of the pages contained to-do lists, while others held snippets of thoughts and reminders. His eyes fell on a page that listed several addresses with notes beside them: possible job, check-in, and next steps. One of the addresses, marked with a star, was a family shelter in a neighboring town. Mason's breath caught. This shelter could be the key. After updating Megan on his findings, he decided to break the news to Lisa. That evening, he visited her at the shelter. She looked up from a coloring book she'd been working on, her face lighting up when she saw him. "Did you find something?" she asked eagerly. Mason knelt beside her, showing her the notebook. "I think we found a clue. This belonged to your mom, and it has addresses of places she's been. One of them is a shelter in the next town. I think she might have been heading there." Lisa held the notebook carefully, her small fingers tracing the cover. She looked up at Mason, her eyes filled with hope. "You're going to find her, aren't you?" Mason placed a hand on her shoulder. "I promise, Lisa. We're closer than ever." The next day, Mason and Megan set out early to visit the shelter listed in Caroline's notebook. When they arrived, they were greeted by a friendly staff member who confirmed that Caroline had been there recently. "She was here for a couple of nights," the staff member said. "She was asking about job opportunities and housing options. She seemed determined to get her life back on track." Mason's heart swelled with relief. "Do you know where she went next?" The staff member shook her head. "I'm not sure, but she did mention wanting to find stable work before reconnecting with her daughter. She didn't say much else, but I could tell she was carrying a lot on her shoulders." As Mason and Megan left the shelter, he felt a renewed sense of determination. Caroline was trying to create a stable life, to be able to care for Lisa the way she wanted. He knew they were close. Driving back, Mason turned to Megan, a smile breaking through his usual serious expression. "I think we're almost there, Megan. She's so close." Megan nodded, her eyes bright with the same hope. "We just need to connect the final dots." When they returned, Mason went straight to Lisa, wanting to keep her spirits high. He shared the latest update, watching her face light up with every word. "Do you really think she'll be back soon?" Lisa asked, her voice barely a whisper. Mason looked her in the eye, a warm, reassuring smile on his face. "I believe so, Lisa. She's closer than you think." The next morning, Mason sat down with Megan to discuss their plan. They had several addresses from Caroline's notebook to check, but each was spread across different parts of the city and beyond. They knew that every moment was precious. Caroline was actively searching for stability, and they wanted to reach her before she moved on again. Their first stop was a community center listed in the notebook. When they arrived, the receptionist greeted them with a smile and listened as Mason explained their search. "Caroline was here a few days ago," she confirmed, glancing at her records. "She spoke with our job placement counselor about work opportunities, but she left quickly. She mentioned she had somewhere important to be." Mason leaned forward, his voice soft but hopeful. "Did she say where that might be?" The receptionist thought for a moment before nodding. "Yes, actually. She mentioned a place called Broadview Kitchen, saying they had an opening for night shifts. I remember because she seemed so hopeful about it." Mason made a quick note of the address, sharing a relieved glance with Megan. The diner was just a few blocks away, so they decided to head there immediately. Arriving at Broadview Kitchen, they were greeted by the smell of coffee and fried eggs. A waitress with kind eyes noticed them and approached, listening intently as Mason explained why they were there. "Yes, Caroline was here," the waitress said, smiling slightly. "She came in looking for work. We spoke for a bit, and I told her we could use some help in the kitchen. She was excited, but she hasn't returned to start yet. I thought maybe she found a better opportunity." Mason's heart sank momentarily. "Did she mention where she was headed afterward?" The waitress paused thoughtfully. "Actually, she said she was staying at the Maple Lodge temporarily. It's just down the street. She planned to stay there while she got on her feet." Mason and Megan exchanged a quick look, feeling a renewed sense of urgency. They thanked the waitress and quickly made their way to the Maple Lodge, a modest but clean motel with a few rooms. At the front desk, Mason introduced himself and explained the situation. The motel manager checked his records, eventually nodding in recognition. "Caroline was here," he said. "She checked in about a week ago, but checked out 2 days later. She seemed like she was in a hurry to leave. I remember she asked about the bus schedule heading out to the outskirts of town." Mason's mind raced. Caroline's movements showed a clear pattern. She was trying to find steady work while also keeping a low profile. It was as if she didn't want to stay in one place too long, maybe worried about making herself vulnerable. The manager hesitated, then added, "Actually, before she left, she mentioned a women's shelter just outside of town. Said she might try to stay there if things didn't work out here." Thanking the manager, Mason and Megan left the Maple Lodge with a new determination. They knew they had to follow Caroline's trail to the women's shelter. It was clear she was fighting to regain stability and security, and Mason felt a renewed sense of urgency to help her find it. The drive to the shelter was quiet, each of them lost in thought. Mason was reflecting on Caroline's resilience, on the love for her daughter that had driven her through these challenging times. He could only imagine the emotional toll of being apart from Lisa. Yet, it was clear that Caroline's every move was in the hope of reuniting with her. When they arrived at the shelter, a gentle-faced staff member greeted them. Mason shared Caroline's story, and the woman nodded with understanding. "She was here briefly," the staff member confirmed, looking sad. Caroline was determined to turn her life around, but she seemed so tired. She spoke often of her daughter. She didn't stay long, though. She mentioned she needed a job and couldn't afford to wait too long here. "Did she say where she was headed next?" Mason asked, his voice filled with concern. The staff member paused. "She asked about the local food processing plant. I told her they were known to hire for temporary work, and she seemed interested. That was the last I heard." Mason thanked the staff member, grateful for each piece of the puzzle they were gathering. Caroline's journey was marked by a fierce determination, and each stop revealed more about her resilience and her love for Lisa. As they left the shelter, Megan turned to Mason. "Do you think we'll find her at the plant?" Mason nodded, his face resolute. "I have a feeling she'll be there. Caroline has been following a path to stability, and that plant might be the break she's been waiting for." With a renewed sense of hope, they drove toward the food processing plant, feeling closer than ever to reuniting Caroline with her daughter. The drive to the food processing plant was tense. Mason and Megan had been piecing together clues, each step bringing them closer to finding Caroline. The weight of their mission felt heavier with every mile, knowing that Lisa's hope for reuniting with her mother rested on their success. When they arrived at the plant, Mason was surprised by its size. The large industrial building buzzed with the activity of workers on their breaks, and the hum of machinery spilled out into the parking lot. Mason approached the front office and introduced himself to the manager, a middle-aged woman with a sharp gaze softened by kindness. "We're looking for a woman named Caroline who might have come here recently looking for work," he explained, showing her a photo. The manager studied the photo, her face softening in recognition. "Yes, I remember her. She applied here about a week ago. We needed temporary workers, so we hired her. She's been coming in every day since then, working hard and keeping to herself." Mason's heart lifted. They had finally caught up to Caroline. "Is she here now?" The manager nodded, gesturing toward a door leading to the plant floor. "She should be on her break. I'll let her know someone's here to see her." Mason and Megan waited, anticipation tightening in their chests. After a few minutes, the door opened, and Caroline stepped through, looking wary. Her clothes were worn but clean, and her face showed signs of fatigue. However, there was a glimmer of hope in her eyes as she spotted them. "Caroline," Mason began, his voice gentle. "My name is Mason, and this is Megan. We're here because we've been helping Lisa. She's been staying at a shelter, safe and cared for, while we search for you." At the mention of Lisa's name, Caroline's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes filling with tears. "Lisa, my baby?" Her voice broke, and she looked away, overwhelmed with emotion. She took a shaky breath, trying to collect herself. "Is she all right? I've been trying so hard to get everything ready for her." "She's okay," Megan reassured her. "She misses you so much, but she's been incredibly brave, and she's holding on to the hope of seeing you again." Caroline nodded, her face filled with relief and gratitude. I was afraid she might think I'd abandoned her. I didn't want to leave her, but I had no choice. I couldn't keep her with me while things were so uncertain." Mason placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Lisa knows you were doing your best. She's been waiting for you, and she's going to be so happy to see you." Caroline wiped her tears, her gaze steady. "When can I see her?" "Whenever you're ready," Mason said, offering her a reassuring smile. "We can take you to her right now if you'd like." Caroline nodded eagerly, a smile breaking through the tears. "I've been ready for this every single day since we were separated." As they walked toward the parking lot, Caroline shared the hardship she'd faced while trying to make ends meet. Each step of her journey had been filled with challenges, yet the thought of reuniting with Lisa had kept her going. Megan listened closely, touched by Caroline's resilience and love for her daughter. "I wanted to come back for her so badly," Caroline admitted, her voice trembling. "I wanted to give her the life she deserves. It's all I've ever wanted." "You've done everything you could," Megan assured her gently. "And now you're on the path to being together again. We're here to help you both." The drive to the shelter was filled with quiet anticipation. Caroline sat in the back seat, looking out the window, deep in thought. Mason could tell that, despite her excitement, there was a lingering fear within her. Fear of whether Lisa would recognize her, of whether the bond they shared would still be as strong. When they arrived at the shelter, Megan went in ahead to prepare Lisa. Mason and Caroline waited outside, the minutes feeling like hours. Inside, Megan found Lisa in her usual spot, coloring quietly. She knelt down next to the little girl, smiling. "Lisa," she said softly, "there's someone very special here to see you." Lisa's head shot up, her eyes wide with excitement. "Is it my mom?" Megan nodded, her heart swelling with joy. "She's waiting for you just outside." Without hesitation, Lisa jumped up, her face lighting up with pure joy. She practically flew to the door, her small feet carrying her toward the reunion she had been waiting for. When she reached the entrance, she stopped, her gaze fixed on Caroline standing just outside, looking just as overwhelmed with emotion. "Mama?" Lisa's voice was a soft whisper, as if she couldn't believe it was real. Caroline's face broke into a tearful smile. "Yes, baby, it's me." In an instant, Lisa ran into her mother's arms, holding on to her as if she would never let go. Caroline hugged her tightly, her tears mingling with Lisa's as they finally reunited. Mason and Megan watched from a distance, their hearts full as they witnessed the powerful bond between mother and daughter. "Mama, I missed you so much," Lisa cried, clutching her mother's shirt. "I knew you'd come back for me." Caroline stroked her daughter's hair, her voice thick with emotion. "I missed you too, sweetheart. I thought about you every single day." The two held each other for a long time, savoring the moment they had both longed for. It was a moment of healing, of relief, and of a love that had only grown stronger through their time apart. As Mason and Megan looked on, Mason felt a deep sense of fulfillment. Helping Lisa reunite with her mother had been more than just a mission. It had been a reminder of the resilience of love and the strength of family. After some time, Caroline looked up at Mason and Megan, gratitude shining in her eyes. "Thank you both from the bottom of my heart. You brought my family back together." Megan smiled, her eyes brimming with tears. "It was our privilege, Caroline." Mason nodded, humbled by the experience. "You and Lisa have shown us what it means to never give up, no matter how hard things get." As the afternoon sun cast a warm glow over the shelter, Caroline and Lisa held hands, ready to start their journey together once again, this time with a renewed sense of hope. The following morning, Mason arrived at Caroline and Lisa's temporary shelter with a sense of optimism. After the emotional reunion, he wanted to help Caroline take the next steps to secure a stable life for her and her daughter. As he walked into the lobby, he spotted Lisa playing with a doll that one of the other children had lent her. She looked up and waved, her face lighting up at the sight of him. "Hi, Officer Mason," she called out, her voice bright and full of trust. He gave her a friendly wave before finding Caroline in one of the side rooms where she was speaking with Megan. They had been discussing job leads and housing options, though Caroline looked hesitant, her hands nervously clasping together. "Caroline," Mason began, joining them at the table, "I know this all feels overwhelming, but we're here to support you every step of the way. Finding stable work and a home are the next steps toward a fresh start." Caroline nodded, taking a deep breath. "I know. It's just been so long since I felt like I had choices. I want to build a life that Lisa can be proud of, but it feels like there's so much to do." Megan placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "You're already on your way, Caroline. You've shown so much strength just getting here. Now it's about finding the right resources to help you move forward." Mason reached into his bag and pulled out a folder. "We've compiled a list of options for housing programs and some community support groups. I also have a contact at a local vocational training center who can help you explore new job opportunities if you're interested." Caroline's eyes softened with gratitude as she looked over the information. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I never expected to find people who care so much." As they discussed options, Mason noticed Lisa peeking in, her eyes bright with curiosity. He smiled and waved her over, patting the chair next to him. "Lisa, would you like to help us plan your new home?" he asked, grinning as her eyes widened with excitement. Lisa nodded eagerly, settling into the chair beside her mother. "Yes. Can we have a room just for me, Mommy? And maybe a little garden?" She looked up at her mother with innocent hope, the image of a brighter future forming in her mind. Caroline smiled, tucking a strand of Lisa's hair behind her ear. "That sounds perfect, sweetheart. We'll work together to make it happen." The conversation shifted into hopeful planning, and for the first time in a long while, Caroline seemed to embrace the possibility of a future without fear or uncertainty. As the hours passed, she shared stories of her skills and interests, and Mason and Megan encouraged her to pursue a training program that would help her find steady work in a supportive environment. After finalizing the initial plans, Mason excused himself to make a few calls. He reached out to a friend who worked with community housing, explaining Caroline's situation and the urgency of her needs. His friend assured him they would do everything possible to expedite the process, offering temporary housing in a safe neighborhood until something more permanent could be arranged. Returning to the room, Mason shared the news. "Caroline, my friend has found a temporary apartment for you and Lisa. It's small but safe and fully furnished. You can move in by the end of the week." Caroline's eyes filled with tears of gratitude. She clasped Mason's hand, her voice trembling. "I can't thank you enough. This is more than I could have ever hoped for." Mason felt a warmth spread through him. Helping Caroline and Lisa had reminded him of the reason he had chosen this line of work. It wasn't just about enforcing the law, but about making a real difference in people's lives. Later that afternoon, Mason took Caroline and Lisa to visit the apartment. As they walked through the modest but cozy space, Lisa's excitement bubbled over. She ran from room to room, inspecting every corner and imagining where her toys would go. Caroline stood in the living room, gazing out the window with a look of quiet contentment. "Mama, look, I can see the playground from here," Lisa called out, pointing to the small park just across the street. Caroline joined her at the window, her heart swelling as she saw the joy in her daughter's eyes. She wrapped her arms around Lisa, holding her close. "Yes, sweetheart. You'll have a safe place to play here," Caroline whispered, her voice full of relief. Mason watched the scene, his own heart warmed by the sight of mother and daughter finally finding a place to call home. He felt a sense of accomplishment, knowing they were on the path to rebuilding their lives. The days that followed were filled with more planning and preparation. Caroline enrolled in a training program, and Lisa started attending a local school, quickly making friends with her cheerful, open-hearted nature. Caroline spent her evenings going over her studies, determined to create a secure future for herself and her daughter. One evening, as Mason visited to check on their progress, Caroline invited him to stay for dinner. She had prepared a simple meal of spaghetti and garlic bread, and the three of them shared stories and laughter around the small dining table. Lisa proudly showed Mason her latest drawings and told him about her new friends, her face glowing with happiness. After dinner, as Lisa played nearby, Caroline looked across the table at Mason, her expression thoughtful. "I don't know how to repay you for everything you've done," she said softly. "Without your support, I don't know where we'd be right now." Mason shook his head, meeting her gaze. "You don't need to repay me, Caroline. Seeing you and Lisa safe and happy is more than enough." Caroline smiled, her eyes shining with gratitude. "Thank you, Mason, for everything." As he left that night, Mason felt a deep sense of fulfillment. His journey with Caroline and Lisa had transformed him in ways he hadn't anticipated, and he knew they would remain a part of his life for years to come. Thank you for joining me for this story. I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed the video, please consider subscribing to the channel to stay updated on the heartfelt stories I'm passionate about sharing. Your support means the world to me and motivates me to keep creating. I'm truly grateful to have you on this journey with me.